Okay, so what is a food chain? So basically, a food chain is a sequence of organisms through which energy passes in the form of food. Now, basically, you would have gotten this information from a video that I had posted already in the Google Classroom, and you would have gotten your assignment to write examples of food chains. However, I must confess that I am having challenges in viewing your responses and to provide you with feedback. So I decided to go ahead and make this video to probably point out some challenges that you might have had. So I want to make it clear that if ever you are asked for a definition for a food chain, this definition is the most acceptable one. You will get a lot of definitions across the board, but just to describe a food chain as a sequence of organisms through which energy passes in the form of food is sufficient. So an example of a food chain is, as you are seeing below, callaloo leaf being eaten by a caterpillar, which is then eaten by a small insect bird that is eaten by a cat. That's a food chain in red. First example. Now note that the arrows in the food chain show the direction in which the energy is moving. So your food chain should always be linear or horizontal. So it must be written across the page. And note that the arrows, please do not leave off the arrowheads. The arrowheads are important because it depicts the direction in which the energy is moving. So another example could be corn, as in a corn plant, or the corn cob could be the leaf, any part of the plant, right, that is eaten by a worm, that could be eaten by a chicken, and that chicken could be eaten by a chicken hawk or a hawk. So we are more familiar with chicken hawk, so you could put chicken hawk there. Now your examples of food chains and food webs should be realistic. Please keep it simple to animals that you are familiar with, and don't try and take animals that you don't know anything about. So you have some students who like to write food chains from the textbook or from the internet. Try and stick to local animals and plants. Your first exercise where you went out and observed different plants and animals in their habitat, so you should just use that experience to come up with some examples of food chains. Alright. Note also another term down there at the bottom of the page is trophic levels. Trophic levels is just basically the level at which each organism feeds. So you have the first trophic level, second, third, and fourth. The first trophic level is described as the producer level, and that is the first level. The second one is the primary consumer, third one is the secondary consumer, and the fourth one is the tertiary consumer. So we have four basic trophic levels: producer, primary consumer, secondary consumer, tertiary consumer. Now every food chain must begin with a producer. A producer is usually a green plant, and the reason we call it a producer is because it converts light energy into chemical energy, and that chemical energy in this context we're talking about is food, as glucose. So if you remember photosynthesis from grade 7, grade 8, it's a process by which green plants use light energy to make food. Now, this process is very important because light is in a form that is not usable by other organisms, but because plants are able to convert that light energy into a usable form called food, example glucose, we call them producers because they produce food for other organisms. And they are also called autotrophs. Autotrophs because they make their own food. So the other levels of the other trophic levels, that's secondary, tertiary, primary, secondary, tertiary, and you can have quaternary trophic level as well. So all the other trophic levels are consumer levels. They are consumers because they consume other organisms for food, and we also term them as aretrophs. So while we call the plants autotrophs because they make their own food, we call the animals aretrophs because they depend on other organisms or others for food. That could be direct or indirect, right? So they feed off other animals for food. So the consumers fall into three types. We have herbivores, carnivores, and omnivores. Herbivores eat only plants, they consume only plants. Carnivores actually consume only other animals. So some books will tell you they are flesh-eating animals. Well, so birds that eat grasshopper and other beetles wouldn't consider those to be necessarily flesh per se in the sense that we know it. But once they eat other animals, we call them carnivores. Omnivores eat a mixture of both plants and animals. Alright? So basically, that's how we'd look at this is the information we get from food chains. So food chains are sequence of organisms through which energy passes in the form of food. Alright, it shows the feeding relationship between the organisms. The food chain is a bit limited because it only shows you one food source for each organism. Now there's a special group of organisms that is left out that we did not mention in the food chain, and I'm just gonna add that now. So the other group that was missing is decomposers, and we don't usually write these in the food chains or food webs. We just know that they are an important part of the food chain, and their role is basically to break down the dead and waste matter that is produced from the food chain. So you know that all organisms usually they produce waste because once they are consumers, they are not 100% efficient, so they will produce waste in the form of urine, feces, etc. And the decomposers, and even when the organisms die themselves, their body is broken down by decomposers. Decomposers includes fungi and bacteria. Alright, so that should give you a little better understanding as to what food chains are. Now, food webs are more complex. So a food web is basically an interlinking of a number of food chains. Right, as a result of that, we're going to have multiples of consumers and producers. So in food chains, this is where it gets a little bit tricky, but once you understand what a food chain is and all the dynamics of a food chain, then you will get the food web very easy. So the food web is basically usually going to look something like this that I have here. So notice that I have 2 producers, and I want you to note how I construct the food web. So in your textbook on page 18, I took an example from there and I added a few more animals just to make it a little bit more complex. So the food web gives you a better representation of the relationship that the organisms have in an ecosystem. So unlike the food chain that you would have seen just a more realistic view would be a food web, where as you can see that, well, I maybe don't have, alright, the best example would be the auk. As you can see, the auk doesn't only eat the kiskadee bird, it also eats an hummingbird and it feeds off the snake. So right off the bat we realize that with a food web you will realize that organisms can have more than one food source. So in a food chain you see that each animal only has one food source, but in a food web you'll realize that an animal can have more than one food source. Note also in a food web we have the aphid, the butterfly, the beetle. All of these animals right here are primary consumer. So there are more than one animal feeding at the same trophic level. Good. And you can go further that the ladybird and the lizard and the hummingbird are also note that the ladybird and the lizard are at the secondary trophic level, sorry. No, that would be the third. So the first would be the hibiscus, which is a producer. Then the aphid would be a primary consumer. The ladybird would be a secondary consumer. Same for the butterfly, a primary consumer because the producer is the relationship. But if you remove one from this food web, because the organisms have more than one food source, they would be able to continue to survive in that ecosystem.